Welcome to History 1. If you enjoy uncovering long-buried secrets from the past, make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for the next part of this captivating story. The Habsburgs were once the epitome of power and grandeur. Their empire spanned across Europe, touching the borders of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the vast realms of Austria. Their name, whispered in royal courts and carried through the pages of history, seemed immortal. But as the centuries passed, the mighty dynasty crumbled, and the world was left wondering what had truly brought their downfall. Was it the decline of imperial strength, the inevitable course of time, or was there something darker, something hidden, that no one dared to speak of? There are whispers, old and forgotten, buried beneath the weight of years, secrets of betrayal, scandal, and unspeakable tragedy that might just explain the true reason for the Habsburgs' fall. Let me take you back to a time when the Habsburgs ruled the heart of Europe, and the world was unaware of the storm brewing within the walls of their palaces. The year was 1711. And the Habsburgs were facing a crisis unlike any other. The throne of the Holy Roman Empire was on the verge of passing to a new ruler after the death of Emperor Joseph I. It seemed as if the family's hold on Europe would only tighten. But what the people did not know was that a shadow had already begun to fall upon them. Empress Maria Theresa, the daughter of Emperor Charles VI, was the rightful heir to the throne. But her reign would be far from smooth. As she ascended to power, she faced a challenge that no one had foreseen, a battle not only for the empire, but for the very survival of her family's legacy. For Maria Theresa, the key to her success lay in marrying well, and marry she did, to the Duke of Lorraine, Francis Stephen, in a match arranged for political power. The alliance was meant to solidify the Habsburgs' dominance, but it did something else too, something far more sinister. Behind closed doors, Maria Theresa and her husband were not the perfect royal couple the public saw. Secrets festered beneath their polished exterior, and it would soon become clear that a dangerous game was being played within the royal court. But the whispers about their relationship were just the beginning. The real secret, one that had been carefully concealed for generations, was about to surface, threatening not only their rule, but the very foundation of the Habsburg Dynasty itself. As Maria Theresa's reign unfolded, rumors began to swirl. There were those who said the Habsburgs were cursed, that a bloodline once so powerful was doomed by its own secrets. What could these secrets be? Was it the heavy burden of centuries of rule? Or was it something more, a fatal flaw that had been hidden from public view for centuries? In this very court, among the marble halls and gilded rooms, one man would come forward with the truth. But by the time he did, it might be too late to save the dynasty. The secrets surrounding the Habsburg family were no ordinary whispers. These were dark, ancient secrets, passed down through generations, concealed in the most guarded corners of their sprawling palaces. But the truth, as history would show, always has a way of revealing itself. In the early years of Maria Theresa's reign, she was a monarch under constant siege. Rival families and nations fought to wrest control from her, while the very nature of the Habsburgs' rule became threatened. Yet, despite the outward appearances of strength, the royal family was plagued by a deeper, more insidious issue. An issue that was invisible to most, but all too apparent to those who looked closely. The Habsburgs were known for their distinctive physical traits, one of which was their prominent jaw, often referred to as the Habsburg jaw. This physical anomaly, inherited through generations, was far more than just a quirky trait. It was a symbol of the inbreeding that had occurred within the royal family for centuries. The Habsburgs had maintained their power through strategic marriages, but these unions were often between close relatives, leading to genetic defects and a weakening of the bloodline. What few knew was that the Habsburg jaw was not merely a cosmetic flaw. It was a manifestation of something far more dangerous, a deep-rooted genetic disorder that plagued their descendants. The effects of this genetic deterioration were beginning to reveal themselves in the early 18th century. Maria Theresa, though strong and intelligent, was not immune to the curse of her family's lineage. The birth of her first child, a son named Joseph II, would mark a turning point. Despite being born into one of the most powerful families in Europe, Joseph would be forever shaped by the genetic legacy of the Habsburgs. His physical and mental health were deeply affected by the family's inbreeding, and many who surrounded him began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor, an unsettling sign of the damage that had been done to the royal bloodline. Joseph II, like his mother, would face the crushing weight of expectations. But unlike Maria Theresa, his reign would be marred by the invisible consequences of the family's secret, a secret that would unravel everything they had built. The family's hold on Europe, already tenuous, began to weaken in the face of this hidden curse. Behind the closed doors of the Habsburg court, few dared to speak of the true cause of their decline. They spoke of enemies, of revolts, of betrayals. But the true enemy was within, quietly eating away at their strength. And as the years passed, the effects of this curse would prove to be more devastating than any external threat they faced. The Habsburgs had always believed that their bloodline was destined to rule forever. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The very traits that had once been their strength, marriage alliances, family loyalty, were now their undoing. And with each passing year, the whispers grew louder. The question that lingered in the halls of power was this: would the Habsburgs be able to overcome their own genetic flaws, or was their fate sealed from the very beginning? As the Habsburgs grappled with the increasingly apparent physical toll their inbreeding had taken, the empire's political landscape grew ever more volatile. It was not merely a battle for power, it was a struggle for survival, both of the empire and the dynasty. The family's golden facade, once impervious to the cracks that showed beneath, was now beginning to crumble. Maria Theresa, despite her personal and familial struggles, would not let her empire fall into the hands of the enemies circling like vultures. She fought fiercely, showing great resilience and an unwavering commitment to the empire. Yet, even with all her strength, Maria Theresa could not stop the tide of decline that was sweeping over the Habsburg family. The curse, as it seemed, was not just a physical manifestation of flawed genes, but a reflection of the dangerous foundation upon which the dynasty had been built. As Maria Theresa worked tirelessly to secure the future of her children and the Habsburg legacy, her son, Joseph II, began to show signs of rebellion, an attempt to break free from the chains of his heritage. Joseph, though burdened with the flaws of his lineage, was no fool. He recognized the cracks in the empire and he knew that in order to secure his reign, he would have to make drastic changes. It was during Joseph II's reign that the Habsburgs' true vulnerability became evident. Though he was intellectually gifted and had great visions for reform, his mental state began to deteriorate under the pressure of the family's legacy. His mind, clouded by the effects of the Habsburg curse, struggled to adapt to the demands of ruling an empire. The very traits that had once been the family's greatest asset, its ability to maintain power through intermarriage, now came back to haunt them. As Joseph's leadership was compromised by his fragile health. But Joseph II was not the only one suffering from the consequences of the Habsburgs' genetic legacy. His sister, Maria Christina, too, bore the weight of this hidden curse. She had married a man of great political importance, Duke Albert of Saxony, and their union was seen as a way to strengthen the Habsburg influence. Yet, as with many of the Habsburg marriages, it came at a great cost. Maria Christina's children, though born to the highest of expectations, were never destined to fulfill them. The strain of generations of inbreeding had led to a decline in vitality across the Habsburg family. In the very heart of their empire, where once they had ruled with absolute authority, now lay a dynasty struggling with inherited genetic flaws. This was the dark secret that few dared to acknowledge, but it was one that whispered through the corridors of power, a silent enemy that no amount of diplomacy or warfare could defeat. But perhaps the most shocking revelation of all was the fate of Maria Theresa's own children, who would carry the burden of their family's cursed bloodline. They too would see their lives overshadowed by the devastating consequences of the Habsburgs' unchecked marriages. Some would never reach adulthood. Others would suffer from debilitating conditions that left them incapable of fulfilling the roles expected of them. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence of their decline, the Habsburgs clung to their legacy with desperate determination. They believed that the dynasty's strength lay not in the health of their bloodline, but in their ability to manipulate politics, forge alliances, and maintain control over Europe. They refused to acknowledge the devastating toll their family history had exacted on them. The tragic irony was that the very thing that made them so powerful, their blood, was also their undoing. As Joseph II's reign progressed, he increasingly sought to modernize and reform the empire. He introduced radical changes, attempting to reverse centuries of stagnation. But the reforms came too late. The empire that the Habsburgs had once ruled with unwavering confidence was now crumbling under the weight of both internal and external pressures. The secrecy of their bloodline was no longer enough to keep the empire intact. Even the most powerful family in Europe could not outrun the consequences of their actions. As the curtain began to fall on the Habsburg Dynasty, few could have predicted the true cause of their downfall. While historians often attribute their decline to war, financial instability, and political missteps, the hidden curse of inbreeding, the genetic deterioration passed down through generations, was the silent killer, slowly weakening the Habsburgs from within. The final collapse came in the early 20th century, with the end of World War I. The Habsburg Empire was dissolved, and the royal family, once rulers of vast territories, was left with nothing but their tarnished legacy. But the true cost of their fall was not just the loss of land or power. It was the end of a dynasty cursed by its own blood, a legacy sealed by the secret that few dared to acknowledge. As the Habsburgs retreated into obscurity, their once mighty empire fractured into pieces. Yet the whispers of their secrets did not die with the collapse. They lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the dynasty's final days and in the annals of history as an empire that had risen on the strength of bloodlines only to fall victim to its own inherent flaws. The true scale of the damage, however, would remain hidden for decades to come. The fall of the Habsburgs was not just a political collapse. It was the tragic unraveling of a family bound by more than just dynastic power. The dynasty's intermarriage, designed to secure alliances and strengthen their claim to the throne, had instead shackled them to a fate of decline. The consequences of their inbreeding had created a slow, ticking time bomb, one that no external forces could defeat. In the wake of the dissolution of the empire, one member of the Habsburg family remained determined to uncover the truth about what had truly led to their downfall. Archduke Otto of Austria, the son of the last emperor Karl I, took it upon himself to investigate the dark legacy of his family. What Otto discovered would shake the very foundations of what had been believed about the Habsburg Dynasty. Otto, who had spent much of his life in exile after the collapse of the empire, began to research the family's history. As he sifted through the centuries of records, he found disturbing accounts that had been hidden away for generations. These were not merely tales of political maneuvering or military defeat. These were stories of sickness, of a bloodline suffering from inherited flaws that had been ignored for too long. Otto's findings were chilling. He uncovered medical records, letters between Habsburg family members, and private journals that painted a stark picture of the dynasty's decline. What stood out in these documents were the personal accounts of the Habsburg struggles with their health, the mental and physical toll of their family's inbreeding. Each successive generation had suffered from some form of debilitating illness or condition, whether it was epilepsy, infertility, or cognitive disorders. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, the family had continued to marry within their own bloodline, determined to preserve their power at any cost. It was during this investigation that Otto uncovered one of the most shocking secrets of all, the existence of a secret pact made by his ancestors. This pact, forged between the most influential members of the Habsburg family, had ensured that the empire would remain in their hands, regardless of the physical toll it took on the family. It was a pact of silence, a deliberate effort to conceal the true state of the dynasty's health from the outside world, from their allies, and from the very people they ruled. The pact, as Otto discovered, had been signed by several key Habsburg leaders in the early 18th century, when the family's health had begun to decline rapidly. In exchange for keeping the family's genetic flaws hidden, the pact allowed the Habsburgs to continue their rule unchallenged, even as their bloodline deteriorated. This dark agreement had been passed down through generations, with each new ruler taking an oath to protect the family's image at all costs. But, as history would have it, the pact failed. The Habsburgs' empire could no longer be saved by political scheming or hidden secrets. By the time Otto unearthed this knowledge, it was too late for the family to reclaim their lost power. The empire had already crumbled, and the world had moved on. But the truth had been revealed. The secret behind the Habsburgs' fall was not just war or revolution. It was a deadly genetic flaw, compounded by generations of silence and denial. What Otto discovered was a legacy of denial, of generations of rulers who had chosen to protect their image rather than their health. Their arrogance in ignoring the genetic consequences of their intermarriages led to a slow, irreversible decay. The fall of the Habsburg Dynasty was not a sudden disaster. It was the result of decades of neglect, of a family bound by blood that had ultimately destroyed them from within. The world would never look at the Habsburgs the same way again. Their once immense power now appeared as a tragic illusion, an empire built on the fragile foundation of a cursed bloodline. Otto, as the last surviving member of the Habsburg family to hold any claim to the throne, lived out his final years in the shadows of his family's past. He became the bearer of their darkest secret, the one man who knew the true cause of the Habsburgs' fall. And yet, even Otto, with all his knowledge, could not escape the legacy of his ancestors. The dynasty's final curtain had been drawn, but its secrets, its hidden truths, would haunt the world for generations. Otto's revelation would not go unnoticed by historians and scholars alike. The discovery of the secret pact, buried within centuries of royal papers and forgotten family records, ignited a firestorm of debate. Was the Habsburg dynasty truly cursed, or had it been the victim of its own unchecked ambitions? The implications of Otto's findings would resonate through the halls of European academia, but the family's tragic legacy was already sealed. As the world moved forward, the shadow of the Habsburgs' fall began to fade into the background of history, overshadowed by the great wars and revolutions that would define the 20th century. Yet, the story of their decline, the shocking truth behind it, remained a haunting tale whispered in the corridors of royal courts and academic institutions. However, the Habsburg family's fall was not the only casualty of their hidden history. The social fabric of Europe itself had been changed irrevocably. For centuries, the royal family had been the unchallenged beacon of authority, their power transcending borders, their influence unparalleled. With the collapse of their empire came a shift in Europe's political landscape, one that no longer deferred to a single ruling family. The ripple effects were felt across Europe as nations sought to redefine their own identities and political structures in the absence of the Habsburgs. New alliances were forged, and old enmities rekindled. The Habsburgs, once the central figures in the political game of Europe, were reduced to little more than a footnote in the annals of history. But even as their empire faded, the Habsburgs were not entirely forgotten. The legacy of their rule and the mystery of their decline would live on in the historical imagination, a captivating tale of ambition, pride, and the price of power. Yet, despite the passage of time, there was one last secret that few knew, one final revelation that remained hidden in the family's records, a secret so shocking that even Otto had not been able to uncover it in his exhaustive search. A hidden manuscript, rumored to be the final will of Emperor Charles VI, contained an eerie prophecy, one that had been kept from public knowledge for centuries. This manuscript, which had been carefully guarded by trusted Habsburg confidants, spoke of the dynasty's eventual demise, but not in the way most historians had come to understand it. It was not merely the decline of an empire, nor the result of political mistakes, but something far more insidious, an omen of a family bound by blood that would ultimately destroy itself. According to the manuscript, Charles VI had foreseen that the Habsburg Dynasty, though powerful and unyielding in its prime, would fall due to a curse of succession. This curse, he wrote, would not be a divine punishment, nor the consequence of external foes, but the inevitable result of the family's insular practices, its constant inbreeding. The manuscript spoke of the eventual collapse of the bloodline, where each new generation would grow weaker, more susceptible to the ravages of disease and mental decay, until the very blood of the Habsburgs became tainted beyond repair. This cryptic document, which had been passed down only among a select few, contained a chilling warning, one that had been ignored for generations. Charles VI had tried, in his own way, to avert the inevitable, but the dynasty's deep-rooted traditions of marrying for power rather than for the health of their bloodline sealed their fate. His final wish, recorded in the manuscript, was simple: that the Habsburgs should find a way to break the cycle before it was too late. But the family's arrogance and refusal to acknowledge their flaw led them down a path of self-destruction. The revelation of this prophecy, long buried and hidden from the public eye, would shock the few who still held interest in the Habsburg legacy. It was a grim reminder that the empire was doomed from the start, not by war, not by revolution, but by the very blood that coursed through their veins. And so, as the Habsburg dynasty's final days drew to a close, the family's once immense power was reduced to mere legend. Their name, though still spoken with a degree of reverence, became associated with a tragic story, a tale of pride, secrecy, and a bloodline that had ultimately become its own worst enemy. The empire was gone, and with it, the last vestiges of a dynasty that had ruled Europe for centuries. But for those who truly understood the depth of the Habsburgs' fall, the true lesson was clear. The price of power was not only the cost of wars and alliances, but the long, slow unraveling of a family that refused to see the truth that lay in their own blood. The story of the Habsburgs may have ended, but the secrets they kept, hidden in the shadows of history, remain a haunting reminder of what can happen when power blinds one to the consequences of their own choices. As the years passed, the Habsburgs' legacy became a cautionary tale, often referenced in academic circles and among royal historians. Their fall had been a complex weave of political, social, and genetic factors. But perhaps the most tragic element was that they were simply unwilling to confront the truth that their bloodline was doomed from the start. And though the empire they built was long gone, it remained a powerful symbol of what could happen when an insular dynasty ignored its own weaknesses. For Otto, the weight of his family's history was ever present, as he spent his life in exile, a survivor of a long-dead empire. He became a kind of reluctant historian of his own family's tragic decline, traveling across Europe to speak about the fate of the Habsburgs and the lessons their downfall could teach future generations. Yet, there was a deeper anguish within Otto that remained untold. Despite all his research, despite uncovering the secrets of his family's collapse, he was never able to fully break free from the legacy of his ancestors. The past, like a shadow, followed him relentlessly. Otto's travels took him to Vienna, the former seat of the Habsburgs' power, where the ghosts of his ancestors still haunted the grand palaces. It was in the heart of this city, among the opulent halls of the Hofburg, that Otto made one final discovery: a document hidden in a forgotten vault, buried under layers of dust and neglect. It was a letter from Maria Theresa herself, written in the final years of her reign, and it contained an admission that no one had expected. She had known the truth all along. The letter was a confession of sorts, one that Maria Theresa had never intended to be seen by anyone. In it, she wrote about the relentless pressure of ruling an empire built on the fragile foundation of her family's bloodline. She admitted to the toll it had taken on her health, her children, and her mind. But most shocking of all, Maria Theresa confessed that she had known the genetic flaws of the Habsburgs would eventually lead to their downfall. She, too, had been bound by the same pact of silence that had been passed down through generations. In the letter, Maria Theresa spoke of the sacrifices she had made to preserve the family's power and the deep regret she felt for not confronting the truth sooner. She had hoped, she wrote, that the dynasty could be saved through force of will, that perhaps their strength in numbers and politics could overcome their inherited flaws. But deep down, Maria Theresa knew the inevitable. Her children, especially her son Joseph II, would suffer the same fate as their forebears. Otto's heart sank as he read Maria Theresa's words. The weight of his family's legacy, which had been carefully concealed for so long, was now laid bare. The emperor's daughter, known for her resilience and political acumen, had spent her final years in quiet torment, fully aware that the family she had worked so hard to protect was doomed. Her revelation added a tragic layer to the dynasty's history, one of a ruler who had fought to the bitter end, but ultimately had been unable to escape the genetic curse that lay within her veins. Otto knew, then, that his family's fall was not just the result of external forces, but a consequence of their refusal to break free from their destructive cycle. The Habsburgs had allowed their pride to blind them to the simple truth that they were only human, vulnerable, and mortal. Their belief in their own invincibility had caused them to ignore the signs that their bloodline was weakening, and by the time they acknowledged it, it was too late. As Otto left the Hofburg, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, the complex tragedy of the Habsburgs. They had been a family of incredible power, with vast influence across Europe. But in the end, they had been brought low not by their enemies, but by the very thing they had tried to protect, their bloodline. The story of the Habsburgs was not just one of political power and empire building. It was a story of genetic fate, of pride and denial, and ultimately, of self-destruction. Otto would carry the burden of his family's secret to his grave, but the lessons of their fall were clear for all who were willing to listen. No empire, no matter how vast, could stand forever if it ignored the flaws within. The fall of the Habsburg Dynasty was not merely the end of an empire. It was the end of a family that had ruled for centuries, bound by blood, fate, and a tragic secret. As Europe moved into the modern age, the Habsburgs were remembered not as the great rulers they once were, but as a cautionary tale of power, pride, and the perilous consequences of ignoring one's own weaknesses. As the years turned into decades, the Habsburg legacy continued to be dissected by historians, philosophers, and descendants of other royal houses who sought to understand the cause of the dynasty's unraveling. The Habsburgs, once seen as the epitome of European royalty, were now a shadow of their former selves, their names lost to time, reduced to mere footnotes in the grand story of history. But despite the fading of their empire, the story of their fall remained ever relevant. Otto, as the last surviving Habsburg with a legitimate claim to the throne, was forced to confront the reality of his family's history in a way that few could truly understand. He had spent his life living in the shadow of an empire long past, struggling to come to terms with the fact that his bloodline had been cursed from its very inception. In the quiet of his exile, Otto found himself drawn once again to the remnants of his family's past. He traveled across Europe, visiting the grand palaces, the battlefields where his ancestors had fought, and the vaults where the Habsburgs had once kept their secrets hidden. He even ventured to the crumbling ruins of the family's ancestral home in Austria, Schönbrunn Palace, where he had spent his childhood. There, amidst the echoes of the empire that had been, Otto found a startling discovery. In a hidden chamber deep within the palace, concealed by centuries of dust and neglect, lay a portrait unlike any other he had ever seen. It was of an unknown Habsburg relative, a figure who did not appear in any of the family's official records or histories. This individual, a young man dressed in royal garb, stared back at Otto with an expression that seemed to carry an uncanny knowledge of the family's impending fate. The portrait, though beautifully painted, seemed out of place in the palace. It was as if this unknown relative had been deliberately erased from the Habsburg legacy, a ghost left to fade into obscurity. Driven by an overwhelming curiosity, Otto began to investigate this mysterious figure. The portrait was not labeled with a name, nor did it feature any inscriptions that might provide clues to the identity of the subject. But there was something in the young man's eyes, something that seemed to speak of knowledge beyond his years. Otto knew that this figure held the key to understanding the final chapter of the Habsburg Dynasty. Through painstaking research, Otto began to uncover the truth about this unknown Habsburg. His name was Ferdinand, a son born to a lesser-known branch of the Habsburg family in the early 17th century. Ferdinand, it turned out, was a brilliant and ambitious young man who had been groomed to take on a leadership role within the Habsburg Empire. However, his potential had been stifled by a tragic illness, an illness that, much like the genetic defects that plagued the family, had rendered him unable to fulfill his destiny. Ferdinand had been a brilliant strategist and military leader, with dreams of expanding the Habsburg Empire beyond its traditional borders. But his body, weakened by the same genetic flaws that had plagued the family for centuries, betrayed him. He died young, before he could ascend to any significant position of power. What Otto discovered next sent a chill down his spine. According to family records, Ferdinand had been aware of the genetic curse that ran through the Habsburg bloodline. It was said that he had kept a private journal in which he described his fears about the future of the family and the empire. In this journal, Ferdinand revealed his belief that the curse was not merely a result of intermarriage, but that it was something far deeper, something inherent to the Habsburgs themselves, something that had been passed down through the ages. Ferdinand had written in his Journal of a Prophecy, one that was said to be handed down from the earliest days of the Habsburg Dynasty. This prophecy spoke of a great empire, one that would rise to power but ultimately fall due to the inherent flaws within its rulers. The prophecy foretold that the Habsburgs would be undone not by external enemies, but by their own blood, by the weakness and decay within their very veins. The deeper Otto dug into this mysterious figure's life, the more he realized that Ferdinand had been the first to truly understand the inevitability of the Habsburgs' downfall. He had been the first to see through the facade of their power, and in his final days, he had written his thoughts down, perhaps in an attempt to warn his family and future generations of the curse that awaited them. Ferdinand's journal, which had been lost for centuries, painted a bleak picture of the Habsburg Dynasty. He spoke of the empire's inevitable collapse, driven not by war or revolution, but by the genetic flaws embedded in the royal family's bloodline. This was a revelation so shocking that it had been carefully suppressed by the Habsburgs themselves, perhaps in an effort to maintain the illusion of invincibility. But now, in the quiet solitude of Schönbrunn Palace, Otto had uncovered the truth, the final, damning truth that his ancestors had tried so desperately to conceal. The Habsburgs, for all their power and grandeur, had been victims of their own legacy, unable to escape the curse that had been passed down through generations. Otto, burdened by the weight of this discovery, realized that the Habsburgs' fall was not merely a tragedy of political misfortune. It was a tragedy of human nature, of a family too proud to break free from its destructive cycle. And in that moment, he understood the real cost of their empire, the cost of ignoring the flaws within, and of allowing pride to blind them to the inevitable. With this final revelation, Otto felt the full weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him. The Habsburgs had built an empire, but they had paid a terrible price for their ambition, and now the secrets of their fall would be known to the world, leaving behind a legacy not of power and glory, but of tragedy, self-destruction, and the consequences of a bloodline doomed by its own mistakes. The revelations Otto uncovered from the mysterious journal of Ferdinand added layers of complexity to the tragic narrative of the Habsburgs. This last piece of the puzzle, one that had been hidden for centuries, offered a devastating perspective. The Habsburgs had not only been blind to their own downfall, but their very sense of grandeur had been built on the assumption that they were invincible. What Ferdinand had written in his final days of illness was the bitter truth that Otto had come to understand all too well. The empire had been doomed from the moment the Habsburg bloodline was set on its self-destructive course. With Ferdinand's warnings now fully revealed, Otto's view of his family's history shifted completely. His ancestors, once proud and revered, had lived under the veil of arrogance, unwilling to face the genetic time bomb that ticked away in their veins. This curse, so deeply embedded in their bloodline, had robbed the family not just of their vitality, but of their vision. No amount of political maneuvering, military might, or strategic marriage alliances could prevent the inevitable collapse, and they had never truly realized it. The curse, however, did not end with Ferdinand's generation. As Otto continued to study his family's history, he found that each subsequent Habsburg ruler had been plagued by the same debilitating conditions so carefully concealed by those in power, so well hidden beneath the polished facade of royalty that the public could never truly grasp the gravity of the situation. Otto knew now that his family's downfall was not just a result of war, rebellion, or economic turmoil, as historians had often described it. Instead, it was a much more insidious force, a hidden genetic flaw that no royal decree or diplomatic alliance could have overcome. The dynasty's collapse had been engineered by its own flesh and blood, not some external enemy. This was the dark legacy that the Habsburgs had tried to deny, and one that had now been irrevocably exposed. In the wake of his findings, Otto became consumed by a sense of responsibility, not just for himself, but for the people who had lived under the shadow of the Habsburg reign. How many had lived their lives believing in the myths of royal invincibility? How many had been blinded by the image of a family that had once ruled with absolute authority, only to discover that their rulers were themselves weakened by forces far beyond their control? Otto had spent much of his life in the shadows of his family's history, but now he realized that he could not continue to hide from the truth. He had to share the full story, the story of the Habsburgs' greatness, their flaws, their rise, and their fall. The truth, as painful as it was, had to be told. Driven by this newfound purpose, Otto embarked on a final journey across Europe. He visited the great centers of power where his ancestors had once ruled, hoping to speak with historians, scholars, and those still alive who had memories of the Habsburgs' final years. In these quiet, somber meetings, he began to share the details of his discoveries, of the hidden pact that his family had made to protect their image, of Ferdinand's prophetic journal, and of the curse that had haunted the Habsburg bloodline for centuries. As Otto spoke, he realized that his story was not one of mere royal tragedy. It was a cautionary tale for all of Europe, for all of history. It was a story of how unchecked pride and ambition could lead to the downfall of the most powerful family in Europe, and how the refusal to confront a family's dark legacy could have devastating consequences for an entire continent. But Otto also knew that the world was changing. Europe had long since moved past the era of monarchies and empires. The Habsburgs were no longer the formidable rulers they once were. They had become a symbol of the past, a dynasty remembered more for its secrets than its power. The old world was giving way to the new, and with it, the lessons of the Habsburgs' fall seemed to fade into the background of a rapidly evolving continent. Yet, even in this new world, Otto could not escape the haunting thought that the curse of the Habsburgs was not just a relic of the past, it was a warning for the future. The lessons to be learned from his family's downfall were still relevant. Empires could rise and fall, but the flaws that lay at the heart of every family, every institution, remained the same. It was not enough to build power on the backs of others, or to rely on a fragile sense of superiority. In the end, every dynasty, every empire, every leader must face their own flaws or risk unraveling in a way that cannot be undone. Otto returned to the remnants of Schönbrunn Palace, his childhood home, now a monument to the past. He stood before the fading walls of the palace where once the Habsburgs had celebrated their triumphs, now empty and silent, and he understood the depth of what had been lost. His family's greatest triumph had become their greatest tragedy, and the empire that had once seemed so eternal had crumbled under the weight of its own secrets. In the final moments of his life, Otto did what few Habsburgs before him had done. He acknowledged the reality of their downfall. He no longer saw himself as the last of the Habsburgs, but as a man who had lived through the consequences of his ancestors' choices. He had uncovered the truth, and in doing so, had freed himself from the burden of their mistakes. For the first time, he could look back at his family's history, not as a participant in their glory, but as an observer of their inevitable decline. And with that acceptance came a strange peace. Otto, the last of the Habsburgs, was finally able to step out of the shadow of his ancestors, leaving behind the legacy of a dynasty that had once been the heart of Europe, but had ultimately been undone by its own secrets. In the twilight of his life, Otto's journey into the depths of his family's history had brought him closer to the truth than any member of the Habsburg Dynasty before him. The Habsburgs, for all their grandeur and influence, had been doomed not by the external forces they once feared, but by the very blood that ran through their veins. The empire they had built with such pride had crumbled slowly, imperceptibly at first, and then, with the sudden crash of an empire whose foundation had been built on the fragile assumptions of immortality. But there was one more chapter in this tragic story. One last twist that Otto had not yet uncovered. In the final days before his death, Otto received a letter from an unknown correspondent, someone who had been following his research into the Habsburg Dynasty with keen interest. The letter was simple, but its message was both cryptic and unsettling. It was signed only with the name, The Keeper. It read, "You think you know the full story, but there is more, much more. The Habsburgs were not just the victims of their genetic flaw. They were also the unwilling participants in a larger game, a game that went beyond the throne of Europe. If you truly seek to uncover the truth, you must look to the very beginning. The secrets lie not in the bloodline, but in the very foundations of your family's rise to power." Otto, by then, was too frail to make much of the letter at first, dismissing it as another fragment of fantasy. But the words of the Keeper gnawed at him. What did this cryptic message mean? If the bloodline had been just a part of the problem, what was the other force behind the Habsburgs' downfall? Otto could not escape the feeling that there was something much larger at play, a hidden thread weaving through history, one that had influenced not only his family's destiny, but that of Europe itself. Driven by the urge to know the full story, Otto made one last effort to uncover the truth. He revisited the archives of Vienna, the old libraries where the dusty, forgotten tomes of Habsburg history were stored. There, hidden among centuries of correspondence, official documents, and royal decrees, he found an old ledger that had been sealed away, untouched for generations. It was a ledger that contained records of the very earliest days of the Habsburgs, long before they became the imperial family that would rule much of Europe. The ledger was filled with names and dates, genealogies, and alliances. But there was one section that stood out. In it, Otto found a peculiar series of notes that seemed to suggest something far more disturbing than any genetic flaw. The first entry was dated to the late 13th century, long before the Habsburgs had reached the height of their power. It referred to an ancient pact, one forged not between royal families but between the Habsburgs and a mysterious order, known only as the Brotherhood of the Hidden Crown. This brotherhood, it seemed, was an influential but secretive society, one that had existed in the shadows of European politics for centuries. Its members, drawn from the most powerful and influential families of Europe, had been rumored to possess knowledge that could alter the course of history. According to the ledger, the Habsburgs had entered into an agreement with this brotherhood, a pact that would secure their rise to power in exchange for a hidden price, one that would only become apparent centuries later. Otto was stunned. His family's rise to power, the very foundation of the Habsburg Dynasty, had been influenced by forces far beyond the political machinations of royal courts. The Brotherhood of the Hidden Crown had played a pivotal role in ensuring that the Habsburgs remained at the center of European politics. But what was the cost of this alliance, and how had it shaped the course of the dynasty's tragic downfall? The ledger spoke of the Brotherhood's ultimate goal: to control the fate of Europe through the royal families, manipulating events from behind the scenes. The Habsburgs, with their strategic marriages and political alliances, had been mere pawns in a larger game, one that had started long before they ever took the throne. As Otto pieced together the documents, he began to understand the true nature of the Habsburgs' fall. It was not just their bloodline that had doomed them, it was the very structure of their power. The pact with the Brotherhood had been a double-edged sword. While it had ensured their dominance in Europe, it had also placed the family under the control of hidden forces that sought to maintain their influence through secrecy and manipulation. Over time, the dynasty had grown increasingly weakened, not just by their genetic flaws, but by the growing realization that they were mere puppets, controlled by the very forces that had helped them rise. Otto's hands shook as he closed the ledger. The truth, it seemed, was far more complex than he had ever imagined. The Habsburgs had not only been cursed by their blood, but they had also been trapped in a web of shadowy alliances and conspiracies that had ultimately led to their demise. In his final hours, Otto understood that the fall of the Habsburg dynasty was not just a story of genetic decline, but a tale of ambition, secrecy, and the cost of power. The Habsburgs had paid the price for their rise to power with not just their health, but their very autonomy. They had been bound by their own ambition, manipulated by the forces of the Brotherhood of the Hidden Crown, and trapped in a cycle of self-destruction that they could neither escape nor acknowledge. Otto's passing marked the final chapter of a dynasty whose influence had once shaped the course of European history. Yet, even in death, Otto's revelations would continue to reverberate through the centuries. The Habsburgs, with their tragic rise and fall, were a reminder to all that no empire, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of its actions, especially when those actions are influenced by forces that remain hidden in the shadows. And so, the story of the Habsburg dynasty came to an end, not with a glorious victory, but with the haunting realization that their greatest enemy had always been themselves, and the dark forces that had shaped their fate long before they ever ascended to the throne.